Okay. Hi, everybody. Greetings. I'm Rhoda Shermer, and I want to welcome you on behalf of NFRPP. And as we approach our October program with a very provocative title, which I will read, which says, Revolution, Inflation, Inequality, Climate Catastrophe. Who said the lockdown was boring? We're going to have an interesting session tonight. We have our speaker, Mark Blyth, coming to us from Spain, and our moderator, Peter Coy, coming to us from some mall where he got stuck before he could get to his office. So this should be very interesting, and we look forward to the evening of a great dialogue between Megan Green, Mark Blyth, and our moderator, Peter Coy. So I want to do a few thank yous. First of all, thank you, Megan, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Peter, for joining us. And thank you, audience, for joining us. And I want to acknowledge our sponsors, the Puffin Foundation, the News Literacy Project, Women for Progress, and the Academy of Political Science. Thank you so much for your support, and thank all of you who keep us going. We really appreciate it. So I'm thinking of turning the program over to you, Peter, now, but I briefly want to give a little bit of an introduction to our speakers. So Mark Blyth is the William Rhodes Professor of International Economics at the Wharton Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. He holds a joint appointment in the Department of Political Science. There's a lot more to Mark's bio, but you can find that on our website, nfrpp.org. Now, Megan Green is a global economist and senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, where she's teaching and writing a book on the drivers of income and wealth inequality and how to address them. She's also the Dame Deanne Julius Senior Academy Fellow in International Economics at Chatham House in London. And there's much more to Megan's bio too, so please visit the website for the full information on these two incredible people who are going to provide us with unpacking a lot of issues tonight with Peter's help. So Peter, take it over.
Hi, I'm Peter Coy. I'm an opinion writer for the New York Times. I have a newsletter that comes out 3 times a week. And if you are a subscriber to the New York Times, I'll hope you sign up for it to get it in your inbox. Right now, I am living the American dream, and I mean that very literally. I am at the American Dream Mall in Secaucus, New Jersey, and I'm going to show you around. This, my friends, is the American dream. It's a little bit empty. It doesn't look like it's making any money, but that's the American dream. And I'm here only because I was trying to get home, but I dropped my wife off the airport and didn't get home in time. So this was the Court of Refuge. So thank you all for being with us. Rhoda has asked us to focus on solutions. So I'm going to ask Mark and Megan to do that. But I also I think you can't really solve a problem until you understand a problem. So I think the first thing I want to do is talk to Mark and Megan about how they diagnose the issue. And Rhoda came up with a fascinating title for this event, and she started off with the concept of the pandemic. And so I would like to ask. I'm going to start with Megan and then go to Mark. Has anything really changed? I mean, we've had a catastrophic global pandemic, a sharp recession, and economic recovery, but the disease drags on. From your perspective, covering economics and policy and inequality, what difference has the pandemic made?
Yeah, so I think the pandemic has made a huge difference in a number of different ways. One, we'll get at the first word in the title of this talk, which was revolution. And that refers to the role of policy in economics these days. Traditionally, when you have a downturn, what policymakers do is their goal is to kind of nudge the economy back to where it was before the downturn. So they measure the size of the hole that we fell down. They come up with a bunch of different policies. They figure out the fiscal multipliers, so how much that will boost growth. And they try to fill the hole exactly. That's traditionally the role of economic policy. This time around, we fell down a massive hole when we put the global economy on ice. And instead of trying to figure out how to fill that hole specifically, exactly, to get back to where we were before the pandemic, policymakers, particularly in the US, have taken a different approach. So instead of just trying to nudge the economy back to kind of our long run potential growth rate, I think the Biden administration is trying to fundamentally prevent the US from dropping down to a lower growth rate, or fundamentally boost it up to a much higher one. So instead of this notion that there's this one equilibrium that the economy kind of oscillates around, the Biden administration think there are multiple equilibria that we could actually end up on. And the policies that they've prescribed are to keep us on a good equilibrium rather than dropping to a bad one. That's a totally different approach to policy making. We'll see what actually gets legislated. But I will say that economics is the only science left that believes in a single equilibrium. So the fact that the Biden administration has embraced this idea of multiple equilibria means that they're finally getting up to speed with every other science that exists out there. So the role of policymaking has changed massively, I think. Some people, and I'm sure we'll get into this later, will look at the size of the stimulus that the Biden administration has proposed, and they'll say we're massively overfilling the hole, we're going to overheat the economy and drive inflation higher. I actually think that their framework for looking at the world is totally different, and we don't need to worry about this. The second thing that's changed significantly is inequality has been exacerbated massively over the course of this crisis. That's across developed countries, across emerging markets, and also between emerging markets and developed countries. But to focus on developed countries specifically, you see it in the high frequency data. So employment for high income people is up 10% relative to before the pandemic. Employment for low income people in the US is down 20% still. So high income people have pretty much bounced back, low income people not so much. So that's just one indicator, but you see it across a bunch of different indicators. And then finally, I would say the pandemic has changed how we look at climate change, actually. And the link there isn't necessarily that obvious. You could argue that as we're encroaching on different biospheres, we're reducing biodiversity, and the chances of a bug jumping from an animal to humans is higher. So maybe that's the connection between climate change and a pandemic. I think it's more that very few economists have kind of modeled what a pandemic would look like in terms of the impact on the economy. And so a lot of economists have realized, actually, we should probably start looking at climate change. Most economists for years have looked at climate change as something that's coming down the pike that we should think about one day. I think in particular, off the back of this pandemic, but also off the back of this summer where we had wildfires and droughts, and floods, that actually most economists are finally admitting that it's not coming down the pike, it's here. So I think climate change has become a much more salient issue in policymaking and in the private sector. I'll leave it there.
Okay, good. Hey, I'm going to ask Mark the same question, but Mark, before you answer the question, can you just tell me how you and Megan know each other? Because the two of you have a little bit of a shtick going. I want to hear about it.
Well, it's not so much a shtick. I mean, basically, we like to agree, we like to disagree. We're in the same kind of space. I'd put it this way: the subset of people in the world that can sit and host a panel at a finance conference, there's 5 of us. Megan and I are 2 of the 5. So you're going to bump into each other. That's fair, Megan, right? I mean, that's kind of like, that's part of what we do as our side gig, shall we say. So, we come across each other in that way, and, we have our moments, shall we say. Now,
we met at an economic festival.
Yes, we met so there's a really amazing thing in Ireland, which, when the pandemic is not happening, Ireland has the funniest people in the world. Fact, right? Just don't even think about it. Fact, right? So then they decided, because they had this huge sort of like, Euro crisis, housing bubble, everything went to hell in a handbasket. The best way to address this would be through comedy. Only the Irish would think this way. The Greeks would think about basically stabbing each other, right? But the Irish are like, let's have a comedy festival. So they established a comedy festival called Kilkenomics in the town of Kilkenny. And literally what they do is they put Meghan on a stage with Irish comedians and Irish policymakers and say, now tell me why housing wasn't such a good bet. And that's it. And this is almost group therapy for the whole nation. So we both became sort of alumni of that organization, and that's where it went from. So
that's great.
That. So anyway, back to the story.
On the pandemic, what's changed in your view over the past couple of years?
Well, the pandemic, there's that. The fact that I'm in Spain and I have to do annoying COVID tests I got on a plane. All right, the serious stuff is this. I want to pick up on the climate change stuff, because this is what I think Meghan is really on to something. Economics has a way of thinking about what they call externalities. So externalities are, pollution, right? Plastic in the ocean, all that sort of stuff. And there's this naive assumption in the sort of the basic model that somehow these externalities will be picked up either by the market or the government through taxation, which ignores the very simple point that any politician that comes along and says, I have a solution, let's raise taxes, right, doesn't really get very far. Hence why we don't really have carbon taxes. The ones that we have don't really hit at the level they're meant to, et cetera, et cetera. And what this has done, this moment, this combination of pandemic and sort of you're on the 3 strikes and you're out, or red lines or red, alarms for climate change, is to focus the mind in that way and say, you really need to rethink this. You can't just keep calling this an externality and pretending it's not there. This is part of the equation itself, and you really need to deal with that. And I think that is true and productive. In terms of where our mentality about all this has changed, and I would tell a slightly different story. I think it depends on what country you're in. The weird thing about the US is when the US decides to change its mind, it changes its mind quite radically. And it can do that in part because it has such a divided governmental system. So you've got elections that are decided by incredibly small majorities. You have parties that are split internally as much as they are vis-a-vis each other. So you get Biden. Think about this guy who was the ultimate centrist, right? The guy from Delaware, all the rest of it, who's now embracing the Green New Deal and berating Senator Joe about dropping his climate pledges, all that sort of stuff. You did not see that coming. We can make quite radical shifts. The Brits were first out of the gate in terms of pandemic support. If you had said to me, Boris Johnson will be Prime Minister, first of all, I would have laughed. But once I'd gotten over the laughter, I would have then said, okay, so what's the odds on him? A global pandemic hits. He's going to do unlimited cash transfers to households at 80% of their income to bottom out the economy, right? The ultimate kind of, if you will, progressive policy. Zero probability. The guy did it. But Martin Wolf, to his credit in the Financial Times, actually had a really good take on this, which is, don't think this is a change of mind. This is what Britain always does in a national emergency. Whenever there's a war, and they call it a war on COVID, to hell with the budget. We'll go to 100%, 200% of GDP. We don't care. We're going to just deal with this thing. But don't think that means we've changed our minds. Now, the more nuanced case, and Meghan knows this case really well, is Germany. So Germany, because the way the elections worked out, and they're doing this coalition, and we don't know who quite going to be there, and all this sort of stuff, you've got this weird world in which the SDP's lost about 10% of its historic support, but it's still the largest party. A guy who was a member of Merkel's coalition, who was running the finance ministry like it was literally a small tin with coins in it, is now the guy who's going to open it up and do green investment. But at the same time, they're trying to form a coalition with the people who want to cut taxes. But despite all that, they're actually moving. Their minds are being changed. That's where the climate stuff is really making a difference in macro policy. So my take, in a sense, is like a gloss, if you will, on what Meghan has said.
Great. I'm going to start right in with a question we have. Came in from Janissa Brunstein. Is it a simple mathematical equation that climate change plus government intervention plus more taxes equals inflation and the extreme gap between the top 1% and the poor, also pushing the middle class to poverty? I'm having a little trouble deciphering the mathematical equation, but and Janissa can't amplify on it here. So let me ask a related question, which is, how worried are the two of you about inflation?
Over to you, Megan.
Yeah, not very. It's not only because, so traditional economists who learned economics 30 years ago will, like I said, look at the size of the hole we fell down, called the output gap, and look at the size of the stimulus, which is 4 times the size of the output gap, and their hair is on fire because they think that stimulus will overheat the economy and will have sustained inflation. I don't think that's the case at all. I think the output gap is nonsense and is sort of an antiquated notion, and that instead we should be thinking about offsetting all of the scarring that we built up, particularly in the labor market over the course of the pandemic. So I don't believe in this kind of traditional framework for viewing the world, but there are a whole bunch of other reasons I don't think we need to worry about inflation. One is that you just can't have a price spiral without a unit labor cost spiral. And economists generally take a shortcut. And instead of looking at unit labor costs, they look at wage growth. And that's because there are 2 inputs to unit labor cost growth. One is wage growth, and the other is productivity growth. The productivity growth is generally pretty stable over time. So it generally works to use wage growth as a rough and ready measure. The thing is, this time could be different because we could actually have productivity gains as a result of the pandemic. So if you look at surveys, a bunch of companies have used the opportunity to automate, to digitalize. A lot of them expect to continue to. Credit is cheap. Companies haven't invested in about 15 years. And so I think there's a lot of reasons why we can be optimistic that companies will invest and that will boost productivity growth. And that's important because we're seeing wages go up. And often economists will say, well, if we're seeing prices go up. And economists will say, well, if prices are going up, then workers are going to feel like they're worse off in real terms. And so they're going to demand higher wages. And then the companies are going to pay higher wages, and they're going to pass that off to the customers in higher prices. And it just ends up being this spiral. But if you have wage growth and productivity growth, it doesn't actually feed through into inflation. So I don't think we need to worry about inflation that much. Also, a bunch of structural drivers that fundamentally underpinned why we've had such weak inflation growth over the past 15 years have been turbocharged by the pandemic. So things like technological innovation, low worker power with low unionization rates, increased market concentration, which put workers in a poor position to negotiate for better terms if they get a new job offer. Things like that have all been turbocharged, exacerbated by the pandemic. And so I think they'll continue to keep upward pressure off of prices. We definitely have higher prices now. Inflation was both predictable and predicted. We knew there would be supply chain disruptions and a mismatch between demand as we reopen the economy and what companies would be able to supply. But I think once we iron those things out, inflation will probably abate again.
Okay, very good. Megan, I just want to say that I agree with you on this. I actually wrote something for my newsletter this week about precisely this cost. I said, don't blame workers for inflation because worker productivity, unit labor costs, productivity has been strong and unit labor costs have flattened out. They have not been rising. That's because, and even if you are not a student of the productivity data, you could just look around and see what's happening because the economy has grown, output is up, and yet the number of people who are working is down. That is prima facie evidence of strong productivity growth. So, Mark, how about you? Are you worried about inflation at all?
I'm terrified. I'm just like spend every moment quaking. But no, I don't. All right. So just now it's uncomfortable. This is it, right? But let's break it down. If you go look at what's actually increasing, it's really interesting. The first one last month was airfares. That's now number 10. It's secondhand car prices. Then I think number 5 is new cars. Why is this? It is global supply chain disruption. And it's really important that people understand what this really means. You make all your stuff on the other side of the planet. The other side of the planet doesn't have that many vaccines. That means they can't run their factories at full capacity. Also, in the pandemic, you decided you didn't want cars, you wanted iPads. So all the chip production went into iPads rather than cars. It takes time to shift this back, particularly when 20% of your workers are off at a given time. When you add all of these disruptions together, you're going to end up with higher prices, particularly as Megan says, when you have higher demand as the people who are vaccinated emerge out of the pandemic, right? So this is predictable and predicted. No doubt you're there, right? And so thinking about this about a week or 2 weeks ago, I went back and I read something. Alan Blinder, who's a very famous central banker from back in the day, when he was a young pup, wrote a piece from 1981 about the sources of inflation, the great inflation from 1970s, 1980s. And he made the following incredibly interesting observations. It was all temporary. It was all transitory. It just happened to be really, really sharp. Because you had those things that Megan was talking about. You had the ability of labor to push on wages. You had relatively closed economies where capital couldn't get out, in a sense. You had this hothouse condition where it was all bid up and prices and wages pushed each other up together again and again. You can't do this now. There's no way that a car factory in Sunderland run by a Japanese multinational can have workers who can bid up wages when you can just move production to France. From the French workers start acting up, you tell them you're going to move the production to Romania, right? This is what globalization and supply chains has done. It is a deflation effect. That is still structural. Now let's consider the last part of this. Yes, wages are going up, but this is the classic real nominal confusion that people get all the time. If prices go up because wages are going up, and then prices go up to match, nothing has changed. It's just a higher baseline. So the numbers may change, but your effective purchasing power hasn't. So we're in a moment whereby, yes, your purchasing power is done. Yes, it costs a little bit more to build a house because you can't get the panels from China. And yes, this will eventually revert itself to some kind of mean. But the notion that we're in some kind of structural inflation like we were in the 70s, what Blinder reminds us is oil went up twice in a 5-year period. Labor supply was constricted after being very, very elastic. And food prices went spiky for about 3 years. It dissipated across the whole world. Even the people who didn't have a giant central bank that pushed up interest rates like we did in the 1980s, all of their inflation rates eventually went down too. Inflations are variables, they're not constants.
Okay, great. We have another question, and I would urge everyone to please submit questions because we want this to be as interactive as possible. And Rhoda will tell me that our job here is to answer your questions. So please keep them coming. There's one from David Ferris, and I'm going to direct it to Megan because Megan, early in her introduction, said that she's not worried about government spending. So the question from David Ferris is, what about the debt that would be incurred if the Biden administration goes and does everything that it wants to do? You don't think you're worried about that? Please explain why not.
Yep. So this is another thing that we're thinking differently about now, not as a result of the pandemic, but it certainly coincided with the pandemic. We economists used to look at debt in terms of a ratio debt to GDP. And so we were looking at what is effectively a stock debt, the amount of debt that we have, to a flow, which is GDP, which grows over time. We never do that in economics. And so Jason Furman and Larry Summers at Harvard wrote an influential paper saying, why do we do that? We don't do this with anything else. Why don't we compare apples to apples or oranges to oranges? So why don't we look at flows to flows, and let's look at debt servicing costs. So the amount that we have to pay every year to service the debt, which is a flow, to GDP, which is a flow. And if you look at debt in those terms, then actually we are at a much lower ratio than we were just after the global financial crisis, for example, because debt servicing costs are so incredibly low. So as long as debt is so incredibly cheap across the developed world, certainly, it depends on what you use it for. If you borrow to buy balls to throw through windows that you then have to replace, and that generates GDP. That's not productive investment. But if you borrow to invest in infrastructure and human capital, that should fundamentally boost growth going forward. And so, we can't afford not to be borrowing with debt so incredibly cheap to engage in that kind of public productive investment. On top of that, the US has more wiggle room than most other countries do when it comes to how much debt we can handle, because we have a global reserve currency, and also because we have the biggest, most liquid asset class in the world, the treasury market. And so it does mean that, there's no magic number at which your debt all of a sudden becomes a problem. Certainly for Ireland, for example, debt to GDP was around 40%. Shortly before they went into a massive crisis. It was slightly lower actually for Argentina before they defaulted on their debts. There really is no magic number, but I think the US can carry more because of those two factors.
Right. Mark, I think, probably wants to jump in and say that he does like the idea of throwing balls through windows.
Oh, at least, if I could find other things that have got a larger mass, I will throw them through windows, and not for any good economic reason either. What would I build on top of that? Because again, sadly we agree with each other. It's so boring. Let me break it down to the basics, right? Here's something that people really need to think about. Governments are not households. Just stop, right? You have a fixed budget constraint because you get a salary. That salary is determined by someone else. Here's the difference between a household and a state. The state gets to do lots of things you can't. I could issue Mark Blyth dollars. Megan, if I paid your salary for the next year in Mark Blyth dollars, how happy would you be?
Not very.
Not very, because you couldn't use them for much. In fact, you couldn't even redeem them at the Bank of Mark Blyth because there isn't one, right? So what do credible sovereigns get to do? They get to basically pay for things. Let's think about the United States. The United States spent $6.4 trillion on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan without raising any taxes. Do you think that they found a sofa somewhere in the Defense Department and went down the back and found that as spare change? Was there a pay-go rule where we cancelled Social Security to pay for that? No, absolutely not. They work with very different constraints. That constraint is largely set by the fact that 70% of all assets in the world are denominated in dollars. There's never been a failed treasury auction since 1978, and even then it was a partial failure. What people are doing is they're buying security. They want their money back in 10 years with a little premium. Nobody holds their gun to the head. That's the debt market. Now, when you're able to sell your debt to people at an effective, including inflation, negative real rate, that means the lenders are paying you to borrow. The fact that you're not borrowing more to then build assets, remember that assets and liabilities summed to zero, is actually kind of a criminal waste. We should actually be borrowing like mad at a negative real rate to build all the stuff we need to do to make our species survive the fact that we're screwing up the planet, and instead of which we're trying to preserve coal in West Virginia, and we're having a conversation about debt. Stop. It's totally different.
So I think I think maybe a good place to turn now, in since we're looking for solutions, is what would, and focusing on the United States for a little while, but we can go to other countries, is how would you restructure what the U.S. does spend money on? Are there things it should spend less on, or things it should spend more on? And I'm going to Megan first on that one.
Yeah, so I have to say I've actually been really impressed by some of what the Biden administration has proposed. We'll see if they get it through, but I live in Boston, for example, and I can't get cell service on the main shopping street in the middle of town. It's just a dead spot. It's one of a million examples of how decrepit our infrastructure in the US has gotten. And so infrastructure jobs are worker intensive. They also tend to be high wage, high hour jobs. So the kinds of jobs we want to be creating. And we haven't been creating those jobs over the past 15 years. We've mostly been creating jobs that produce the stuff we want to buy, which is services and low wage, low hour jobs. So a infrastructure spending package can upgrade the US workforce as well. And on top of that, if you make it a green infrastructure package, green jobs tend to be higher wage, higher hour than fossil fuel jobs, at least. And so that just further upgrades the US labor market. So I would do that. The other thing is, I would say, you know, I go to a lot of conferences, mostly online now, and I feel like half of them at least end with everyone saying, yes, we need to invest more in education. So this is kind of a no-brainer for economists. It's a way to boost your human capital, improve your productivity growth, boost your potential growth, maybe jump you up to a higher plane. And yet no one ever does it because it doesn't really pay off within an electoral cycle. So I think that some of the measures that the Biden administration has proposed to invest in human capital are really important. I would suggest we need more of them, particularly when it comes to retooling and reskilling workers, because we know that some industries just aren't coming back the way that they were before, and some companies just aren't coming back. And so those workers are going to need to figure out how to find new jobs. And I've looked it up. There are, I think, 16 different US government agencies that offer retooling and reskilling programs. I have no idea how I would navigate that. I don't know how most people could ever figure that out. I do know that they all require that you train full time, so you can't work at the same time, which is a no-go for many people. So I think there's a lot we can do on the education, reskilling, retooling side that would boost our fundamental growth over the medium to long term as well.
Megan, back when Biden was still running for office, I wrote a piece for my old employer, Bloomberg Business Week, pointing out that he's had created a coalition of on the green issues of the environmentalists, labor, and the social justice movement. And I said that's a fragile coalition. My argument was, in particular, between the environmentalists and the labor, because the environmentalists' number one goal by far is to do something about climate change. Labor wants to create good jobs. Biden tries to square that circle by saying, we'll create good jobs, saving the environment. And okay, fine, except if you really want to bring down greenhouse gas emissions in a big, big way urgently, then you want to do it at a large scale, which means you want to do it as efficiently as possible, which means you ideally use the least possible labor that you can, because labor is costly, that contradicts the goal of the labor movement, which is to create a lot of high-paying jobs. What do you think about that?
So labor's been super cheap for 15 years. So I'm not sure I agree that creating those jobs can't create jobs for lots of workers. Possibly firms would try to automate some of those jobs instead. I think you kind of point to an important point. I'm actually writing a column about this for Monday in the Financial Times. And that's that there are going to be winners and losers from this transition. And I don't think any of us have been particularly honest about that. We're seeing it now in Europe, right, with massive spikes in energy costs. If we begin this transition in earnest to achieve net zero by 2050, which is most countries' target, we're going to have a supply shock. That's necessary. Prices are going to go up. Some workers will be out of jobs. Overall, for the macroeconomy, it will be net positive, particularly over the medium to long term. But in the short term, actually, it could be quite a painful adjustment. And the longer we wait to really begin it in earnest, the more abrupt the adjustment will have to be, and the harder it will be for the losers from that. And I guess the parallel I think of when thinking about this is globalization and China joining the WTO. And economists argue, look, yes, China will join the WTO, and it's okay because over time, workers will switch from one industry that has to compete with China to another industry. And so if you look at the economy as a whole from 10,000 feet above, then actually everybody's better off. And in reality, that hasn't really been true. Not everyone was better off at all times, for sure. And we didn't really have an honest conversation about the fact that there would be definite losers and we should figure out how to compensate them. And so now we're seeing this backlash against globalization. And I think there are definitely going to be losers from the climate transition. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but we should be honest about figuring out how to compensate them and having that conversation to avoid the anti-climate change backlash that might result if we don't.
Very good. A few people have been sending messages to me in a way that I can't read them. So please use the Q&A feature. Stephen's saying exactly the same thing I see now. That way I'll be able to see all the messages. They won't just flash up on my cell phone while we're talking. We have a question from Pepito Soto, who, and I'll address this one to Mark, although I'm sure Megan will have thoughts as well. Inequality. What's the solution to inequality?
Usually revolution, war, or catastrophe. I mean, frankly, in history, that's how you do these things. There was one period after World War II, notice, that followed a giant war when you were actually able to do something about this. But, you know, the reason that Thomas Piketty got a Nobel Prize back in 2013 was for daring to break the economic consensus and proving with huge amounts of data that left to its own devices, capitalism is an inequality generating machine. Because the rate of return on assets, owning a house in Boston, flipping it, buying another one, levering yourself up, is way better than just earning, like, you know, Joe Schmo wages somewhere else in the hinterland. And if you run that over time, you basically get this divergence, and that's your inequality. Now, there's a lot more to it than that. There's financialization. There's a whole bunch of things that we've done in terms of policy to make it worse. But if that's the root cause, it's kind of built into the framework. And that's kind of the dirty little secret we don't want to talk about. Now, let's go back a little bit, because I want to get to some of the stuff you were talking about before. Unfairly, I'm going to go back to this one because I think it's important. Here's the other thing about climate change and distribution we don't want to talk about. Megan's exactly right. It's all about who pays the cost for this. We have this assumption, particularly in the United States. I find, even though I've lived here for 30 years, I'm a citizen, the whole thing, right? I just find it really puzzling the way that when we have these conversations, we assume that there's a puzzle, there's a problem, and there's a thing called the government. And it's unified and it knows what to do, and with the right information, it will just do it. Do we have any evidence that that's true? All of Biden's stuff hangs by a thumbnail, right? It's just, it might pass, some of it might pass. Congress has been gridlocked for how long? Everything hangs on tiny little margins. Now, let me tell you a little story about this. Here's how I think about American politics and the possibilities for what we can do. So you've had polarization starting with the Gingrich Congress that is now going into hyperdrive. You've got 70% of one party. Imagine you were telling a story about a country in Europe, right? Hey, Megan, there's a country in Europe, 70% of one side refuses to accept the result. They're like, oh my God, that's really dangerous. Well, that's us, right? That's where we are. That's the fact of it. We just kind of ignore that, right? So we've got this very fragile political moment. Now, if you look at America as a map and you dump the electoral map up, if you do the following map really maps onto it. Start in Alaska, go with the Dakotas, go down through Oklahoma, go all the way down East Texas, hang a left, go straight through Louisiana, Alabama, come up and end up in West Virginia. I call it America's carbon smile. The business model of every single one of those states is the exploration, transportation, transformation, and propagation of carbon assets. Now, they're the people that are staunch Republicans. Why? Because they don't care about abortion and guns? No, because that's their business. Now, on the coasts, you've got the Democrats. And the Democrats are like, we need clean energy and we need to do something about the environment. Why? Because it doesn't cost them anything. All they care about is electricity. They like to have it from nice, clean sources. They don't want it from these people in the hinterland. And they don't trust them because, you know, they care about abortion and stuff like that. There must be something weird with them, right? So you have this polarization. Now, you've got a trust game. The trust game is, for me to give up my assets, I need to know that you can credibly commit to bailing me out. That you are, in your Green New Deal stuff, going to take all of your resources and bail me out when I voluntarily give up my way of making a living. Why would they believe us? Why would they actually think that that's a credible bet? And they don't. And that goes a hell of a long way to explaining why we have gridlock, why we have polarization, and why the environment in particular is such a polarizing issue. It's not that they don't get it, they get it. They just don't trust blue states to bail them out. That's the distributional politics that we have to really navigate. Instead of which we're like, well, what's your solution? Well, what does that mean in that context? Your solution is to fix the politics. And if you don't do that, you're not going to get anywhere.
I see that point. I'm really happy with all the questions that are coming in. I may not get to all of them, but there are a few I really want to hit. And this one I'll direct to Megan. It's from Robert Shapiro. It's about trade with China. So far, Biden has left on the tariffs that the Trump administration put on China. Is that a good idea? And if not, what would you do instead to deal with trade with China? And Mark, you might have some thoughts about that too, but I want to start with Meg.
Yeah, sure. So I think if you look at Biden's approach to China, the tactics are different, but the end goal is kind of the same. At the end of the day, the Buy American strategy is not that different from the Make America Great Again strategy. It just has much cuddlier language. But if you're an actual business operating in these places, nothing has really perceptibly changed. And so, you know, I think that's a good thing. Yeah, I think that, you know, China has been very aggressive in laying out its goal of becoming the biggest economy in the world based on excellence in things like machine learning, AI, high-tech industries. And I think there are real concerns about IP and government subsidies, and I think we should address those. Were the tariffs the right way to do that? Absolutely not. They do absolutely nothing to address those things. And they end up just generating, I mean, tariffs generally just end up creating deadweight losses in an economy. And a lot of them were borne by the American consumer, of course, not by Chinese producers. The Biden administration hasn't rolled them back but I think they'd be happy to as long as they got concessions in exchange for it. So I think if the Biden administration could extract things from China, they would happily roll back some of those tariffs, but those concessions haven't been forthcoming. But fundamentally, I think the ultimate end goal for the Biden administration isn't very different on China from what the Trump administration was trying to achieve. They're just using different tactics.
Right. So the free traders would say, look, a tariff is just imposing costs on our own consumers. We should unilaterally roll them back because we're only hurting ourselves. I guess, and then of course the counter is what you said. Well, we need to use them as bargaining chips. So I guess you're taking the latter point of view. Is that right?
Yeah, and also it's not just pure economics. There's a political consideration as well, and unilaterally just rolling back all of the tariffs on China wouldn't play well with, I think, the heartland of the U.S. So I think that's a consideration as well.
And Mark, do you have any thoughts on that you'd like to add?
Well, just one. There was a very important book that came out in 2020 by Michael Peres and Megan. Remind me, who the hell was the other guy? Matt Klein, of course, right. Trade Wars or Class Wars. And they make the following point, and it's one of those things that kind of just flies under the radar, right? When you have loads of economies in the world that are all trying to do exports, and one of them becomes more efficient than the other, what has to happen? They will substitute for the stuff that you make. That has to result in higher unemployment in the economy that doesn't have that advantage. So how do you protect yourselves? You might do tariffs, you might devalue your currency, whatever. But once you get to a world economy where everybody's trying to play the game of let's do exports, and at the current moment we have the EU as a whole running a surplus against the rest of the world. You have the whole of East Asia running a whole surplus against the rest of the world. And the only bit that's running the corresponding deficit is the US. It has to literally result in job destruction. Now, once you accept that as a kind of basic fact, it's arithmetic, it's not even math, right? Then the understanding of free trade, everybody benefits really takes on a different cast at that point. We might benefit in a consumer surplus sense. Yes, there's more cheap shit in Walmart, but that doesn't really matter when you don't have the money to buy it because you're not able to generate jobs. And I think going to Megan's point that we started off with is what's changed in the mindset. I think that's changed in the mindset. When I hear standard free trade arguments now, it's like, I get it, but we don't live in that world. Now, when I move even further on this, I look at what China has done. Look what China is trying to do to itself. If you think about Xi's shared prosperity program, it's kind of insightful. What they did was they looked around and said, so America just basically allowed inequality to go on a rip. They sent their industries abroad. They basically allowed their investor class to make off with all the gains for 30 years. What did they get from that? A bald guy who owns more money than God, who has a personal spaceship. Is that really where we want to go? Let's destroy the higher education system that's built up in the private markets that allows rich Chinese people to give their kids an advantage over everyone else. I find it hard to disagree with that personally. Now, I'm not a fan of the overall regime or where they're going, but I understand the motivation. We're now working in very different worlds. The way that America looks at the world and the way that China looks at the world is fundamentally different. This view that we had this globalized free trade world and everybody understood the rules of the game, it's done. And we're holding on to Trump tariffs because we don't know what to do, because they've decided to change the rules so much that we don't have a response.
Mark, I somewhat agree, but I feel as though you're giving maybe Xi Jinping a little too much credit for being a small d Democrat. I think his motivation might be more to cling to power because he doesn't want to have any rival power bases. So tearing down the wealthy tech entrepreneurs is one way to do that. What do you think about that?
Well, those two explanations can go together. Of course, the Communist Party of China, the clue's in the name, doesn't want to have any rivals. I totally accept that. But if their legitimacy comes from not just economic growth, everyone can have growth. What matters is how it's distributed. If they recognize that fact, they have to do something about the distribution. China's Gini coefficient, the measure of unemployment, has become greater than the United States. They have the word communist on the front. You can't ride that one forever without falling off the fence.
That's a good segue into a question that we got from a Dr. Tom Grooms, and I'll pose this one to Megan, which is, can capitalism and equality exist simultaneously?
Yeah, so I think there you have to be really specific about your definition of capitalism. There are lots of different kinds of capitalism. We tend to practice a certain variety that tends to be turbocharged in the US and the UK, the Anglo-Saxon version of capitalism. And I think there we figured out that the markets are pretty rigged. And as Mark said earlier, drive inequality higher. There's a German version of capitalism that's quite different, that has workers of companies sitting on the board, for example, which boosts worker power pretty significantly and results in better wage negotiations for workers, which reduces income inequality as one example. That's less turbocharged and a little bit more consistent with this idea of having capitalism and equality at the same time. I think the Anglo-Saxon version of capitalism really has traditionally embraced Milton Friedman's shareholderism, where the whole point of a corporation is to boost profits for the shareholder. And there's been a real backlash towards that in lip service, at least over the past couple of years, where companies have come to announced that actually instead of just focusing on shareholderism, they're going to focus on stakeholderism. So they're going to consider their workers, their communities, their suppliers, not just their shareholders. And, you know, intuitively, that should help companies' bottom lines. I think there's one problem with Milton Friedman's whole shareholderism thing, which is that he assumes that the government's setting the environment, so setting up the rules of the game, and companies are just the actors that are playing the game. And what we see now in the US in particular, but also in the UK to a certain degree, is that companies are setting up the rules of the game and they're playing the game. And so a lot of the markets are rigged I'll give one example, which is just market concentration, which has increased significantly in the US over the past 30 years or so, more 40 years, I would say. So that you have superstar companies rising to the top. Tech is a great example. Pharma is another good example. Healthcare, also retail. And so you have Google and Amazon acquiring all of their potential competitors and dismantling them. And so they've ended up just dominating and gaining market share. If you're a worker in one of those industries, you only have a handful of potential employers, and they all talk to each other and know what each other competitor offers in terms of compensation. And so as a worker, if you want to leave, you have a handful of possible employers. Let's say you get a job offer from one of them. You're not in a great position to negotiate for better terms at all. And so that puts downward pressure on wages, which exacerbates income inequality. So it's one example of how the markets are really rigged against workers in particular, and against smaller companies. So I would say that the kind of capitalism that we're engaging in right now is not consistent with reducing inequality, but there are things we can do. So someone asked what we could do about inequality earlier. Beefing up antitrust is one thing that we could do. Addressing kind of campaign donations and the amount of money spent in the US on lobbying could also help reduce market concentration as well. Encouraging workers to unionize, penalizing companies who just blatantly break the law in not allowing workers to unionize. That would help as well, because unionized workers are better able to advocate for higher wages, and that reduces income inequality. So these are some of the other factors that I think we could do to address inequality as well.
Great. I love your emphasis on solutions, because that's what we're here for tonight. Mark, what would you say for solutions? You can't say kicking a ball through a window.
Well, first of all, I'm Scottish, so you came to the wrong guy for solutions. We just basically do problems. So I don't know why I'm here in that regard. All right, look, there are countries that are very different in this regard. I hate to go to Scandinavia. They're smug, they're white, they're boring. I get it, the whole thing, right? But I'll give you an example of this. So my first foreign trip post-COVID was at the end of August. I went to do a PhD workshop with students from all over Europe at Copenhagen Business School. Now, what I didn't know was that the day before I got on the plane, the Prime Minister of Denmark, Mette Hendriksen, I think her name is, got on television and basically said, all right, here's the deal. We've done all the numbers. We think we had our COVID spike. Given the fact that we've all been good and rule following and like we're vaccinated, I believe that the figure for Copenhagen is something absurd, like 91% vaccinated, which means everyone who can possibly be vaccinated is. I think what we should do is just get rid of the masks. So I got off the plane, and I was the only person wearing a mask in the whole airport. I was the only one on the tram going from the airport. I got to town, I'm like, what is going on? They're like, oh, it's over, we're done. Now, what that bespeaks is something that we've lost, an astonishing trust in government and an astonishing reciprocal trust in each other. We've managed to turn that, a public health crisis, into an identity politics / partisan / you are my enemy moment. And that's incredible. And I just find sort of like talking about policy solutions in an environment where you have that is your real basic problem, to be kind of astonishingly naive and also self-delusional. Like, we should not be talking about solutions. We should be talking about the real problems. I want to talk about capitalism generating inequality. Let me give you a couple of figures. 2017 Boston Federal Reserve report. Average net family wealth of a white family in Boston. Now remember, this is Beacon Hill and Dorchester all put into a blender and averaged out. $247,000. Black family in Boston, $8. $8, right? That's here right now in America, right? Okay, let's go there, right? Let's think about, you know, the entire sort of Mesra Haharahan's wonderful book, The Color of Money, the entire history of redlining African-American districts so that the ability to build wealth through housing has been destroyed for 3 generations. And then we'll turn around and say smugly, these people need to bootstrap themselves up. Like, before we really start talking about yet another policy intervention, do we need enterprise zones? Shouldn't we have this incentive? We actually need to look at the basic functioning mechanisms of our society and how they are deeply broken. My closing comment on this, my last day in Copenhagen, I went to a park with a couple of PhD students of mine who are now in their 40s with 2 kids. It was a lovely day. Went to the local supermarket, got some cheap bubbly, sat there with cheese and wine and all this sort of stuff, and everybody ran around. And the one thing I thought was, when is the crazy homeless person going to come up and screw all this up? And they're not there because they don't allow that to happen, because everyone thinks it's a good idea to have a decent functioning society. We're so broken, we can't even get to that. When was the last time you went to a park with a bottle of wine and didn't consider yourself a wino?
Great point, Mark. I agree that I think sometimes we reach for economic answers, fiscal policy or monetary policy, when we're trying to put a Band-Aid on a problem that really has a different origin. And we should go to the having a functioning government that does what it's supposed to do: take care of the homeless, educate children, make food safe, keep the sky clean. These are not things that you do to just like pump out. It's cutting interest rates, for example, is something that the Federal Reserve can do and does, but it's a blunt instrument that can't solve the sort of micro scale problems that need to be solved one at a time. So great. And I want to go to a question now that came in. This is more technical than most of the questions that we've had.
Then Megan gets it.
It's about, okay. So this will be from Megan then. It's from Jared Perry. If the US Federal Reserve begins tapering its quantitative easing, namely its purchases of bonds, what are the potential adverse effects on the economy? And specifically, if rates go up, will that slow the economic recovery, regardless of stimulus amounts? Would the value of the dollar rise? Would that have an impact on trade?
There's a lot there to unpack in the remaining 3 minutes, but yeah, I'll start.
Megan, we can go past 8. We don't have to end right at 8, yeah, but we'll see how.
I think she was saying that for me because it's now 2 o'clock in the morning in Spain. So, we might be on borrowed time. My hell-raising days might be over.
Okay, got it.
I'll start with the tapering question. I have to say that I thought that there would be a taper tantrum for sure, even though the Fed promised that they would signpost it way in advance, because whenever they signposted it, that represented a binary change in how they were thinking about asset purchases. And it didn't happen. And I think the markets have absorbed this news that the Fed's going to taper incredibly well. I mean, in September at the press conference, when the Fed said they'd be tapering imminently, which basically meant November, the markets barely moved. And so I think when they begin tapering, there will be very little effect, actually. The question is, will they ever get to shrinking the balance sheet? Because, of course, tapering their purchases just means they'll buy assets more slowly. But it doesn't mean that they'll shrink their balance sheet. And at some point, they'll end up having to shrink their balance sheet. And the last time they ended up doing that, we ended up with a massive rate spike at a certain point because they had all of a sudden shrunk it too much. And I think that's the bigger worry, but that is so far down the line and may not come for decades, actually, that we don't really need to worry about it. If rates go up, that will absolutely slow the economic recovery. And this is the real concern about stagflation. So if Mark and I are wrong and these inflationary pressures are sustained and we end up in this new regime with much higher inflation, just as, we had this precipitous fall as we locked down the economy, then we had this incredible boost as we reopened. Now we're in the long, hard slog part of the recovery. And so growth is slowing. It's slowing from rates that are way above potential, but it's still slowing. So if we get high inflation and slowing growth, central banks get into trouble because they can't hike rates or cut them and deal with both of those issues at the same time. It's a central banker's worst nightmare. So hiking rates will definitely slow the economic recovery. I have a bigger concern, actually, that it will also cause a bunch of defaults in the corporate sector. Most of us economists forget that before this pandemic hit, we were all reading tea leaves to figure out what would end the longest recovery that the US has ever had. And we didn't realize it would just hit us in the face in the form of a virus. But many of us, myself included, thought leverage in the corporate sector would be the problem. And of course, that's just been massively turbocharged by the Fed's bond buying programs. And so corporates have leveraged up hugely. There are a bunch of zombie companies. And so if the Fed starts to hike rates, their borrowing costs go up. So we might have some trouble. So I actually don't think the Fed's going to be able to hike rates very much in this cycle, even if they're worried about inflation, because there's a financial stability aspect of their mandate that they'll have to keep an eye on. And they've pumped up, corporate debt so much that they would undermine that piece of their mandate if they hike rates significantly. The dollar, I think, over the medium term should be lower, actually, regardless of what the Fed does, because our budget deficit is big, our current account deficit is pretty big. So those two things should put downward pressure on the dollar over the medium to long term. I will make no attempt to forecast the dollar in the short term, because I think currencies are the hardest thing to forecast. And I'm fortunately an academic now, so I don't have to do that anymore. But structurally, there should be downward pressure on the US dollar.
But let me play that a different way, right? So let's say that interest rates go up. Totally agree the fragility in the corporate sector because they're just loaded up on debt. Like, let's remember American Airlines basically going, oh, you want some kind of strings for like giving us free money? No, we'll just issue more debt because basically we've got a negative real rate, right? So huge fragility there, zombie companies, you're totally right. But what about the rest of the world? So what's been happening is we've been pushing rates down and down and down. But it's not just the central banks. There was a paper a couple of years ago that came out that said interest rates have been falling since the 1300s. I saw a tweet from Adam Tooze today, but I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. Have you seen this one, Megan? Interest rates have been falling for 5,000 years. Now, we can go into the reasons for this, but basically, you have, to quote NPR, a giant pool of money, the global capital stock. And for various reasons, we're just not using it. So guess what? Money's cheap as hell, right? So you've got massive amounts of cheap money. Now, who's loaded up on this looking for yield? It's people who have said, well, we can get nothing in Milwaukee. Let me lend to Malawi. So you dump your money in emerging markets. Now, those rates go up and emerging markets are down, and particularly in a recession, what happens? Giant sucking sound as all of that money goes flying back into the United States. And then the dollar strengthens, the trade deficit widens, we import more stuff, despite the fact that our dollar's going up, which encourages us to do more. You just end up with the worst nightmare for the Fed, because here's the dirty little secret. The Fed is the global central bank, because we issue the global currency. And we're not allowed to say this in Congress or on TV, but amongst adults we can say it. So they don't just have a financial stability mandate for like corporates in America. They have a financial stability mandate for the globe, and they don't know how to get out of this because there is no obvious answer. Megan, if I were to ask you, if you were running the Fed and you were looking at this, what would be your playbook for getting out of this?
You can't. I think all central banks are stuck with low rates for a long time, buying up everything that's not nailed to the floor.
Now, here's the thing. If one part of the family lends another part of the family some money and eventually they build a house and pay it back, the net asset position in the family hasn't changed, right? So one part of the government lends another part of the government money and then sticks it on its balance sheet. That's not a commercial bank transaction. There's nobody outside that needs to pay the money to valorize that transaction. You've just swapped it from one side to the other, right?
I believe you're describing debt monetization, which central banks.
Yes. Now, that's a problem if it produces inflation. But if you live in a world in which you've got structurally low interest rates and structurally low inflation, like you said, they're going to have that stuff on their balance sheet for a long time, right? Because where else are you going to put it?
So you know what? We are running out of time. What I want to do is bring Rhoda in to see if she's satisfied that the two speakers and I have done the job we were supposed to do. And if not, we'll keep talking until she's
I
happy.
refuse to do it. I just simply refuse.
Okay. Rhoda, are you there?
Here I am. Do you hear me?
Hi, Rhoda.
Yes.
Hi, everybody. Well, wow, you guys were so stimulating and challenging. It was fantastic. Peter, I'm just wondering, you had to look at 2 places for questions. Did you get most of them addressed?
I got most of them in. Yeah, I didn't answer every question. There was a question about endangered species that I didn't get in because I thought it was a little bit far afield. A couple others, but I think we got most of them.
Okay, because I like when our audience goes away with the information they need.
Right.
Yeah, so that's helpful. So I can only say this was exceptionally interesting, this program. And Mark, I so appreciate that you stayed up for us. And I hope you're enjoying Spain.
I definitely am.
You are good. And Megan, thank you so much. Outstanding evening. And I'm sure our audience appreciates it. And we'll be having a video that many people view when they can't make our program. And we'll send you a link for that. And Peter, outstanding as usual.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it. We all learned a lot, I'm sure of that. And I'm going to urge our audience to please fill out the survey that we will be sending you, because we really rely on your feedback so that we can keep doing a better job. So when you get the survey, take the few minutes and fill it out.
Can I just say one thing before we go? I'd like to call Peter Coy on his lies, because he's not really dropped off his wife at the airport and he's in a shopping mall. He's actually wearing an orange jumpsuit. He is in federal prison, and what is behind him is a highly illuminated Supermax. I would just like to put that out there so we're all clear.
You could be right, Peter? You could be right. Where are you? Yeah.
It's a Supermax. They're about to take me away.
Oh, no, we need you, Peter.
Oh, just give it till 2024, Peter. You work for the Times, you will be taken away.
Yeah. So all I can say to all of you is that if we were in a live audience, people would be standing up and applauding you. So I'm applauding you. Thank you so much.
Invitation.
Thank you.
And we'll meet again.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.